Good morning to all who are watching me. My name is Eleanor Ellie Vance, but everyone here in Portland, Oregon knows me as Ellie the Pie Seller. If you ever pass by my little shop, Ellie's Corner Bake Shop, you're sure to see me. I'm an old woman, 68 years old, with short white hair, selling what are said to be the best pecan and cherry pies in the Pacific Northwest. Today, after a long time of keeping this story locked inside, I'm decided to tell what happened to me. Some things we hold on to for so long that they begin to rot us from the inside. And this story is almost choking me with how long it has been caged. Before I detail my story, take a moment to drop a comment about where you're connecting from, and please hit that like and subscribe button. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this intense family drama unfolds. I was born in 1955 in a simple wooden cabin in the rural Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. My father, Robert Vance, was a man respected by everyone in the region, a small general store owner, always wearing his Stetson hat and a hand-rolled cigarette at the corner of his mouth. He was the kind that commanded respect just with a glance, you know? But inside the house, oh, that was another story. I grew up in a family where my father's word was law. My poor mother lived with her head bowed, always nodding, always obeying. We were 6 siblings, 4 boys and 2 girls, and I was the youngest. The boys could do everything, go to school, play in the street, enjoy freedom. My sister Sarah and I, on the other hand, barely left the yard. "Here, a decent girl doesn't wander around," my father would say, in that tone that allowed no reply. "A girl is here to learn how to care for the house, for the food, and to prepare to be a wife." And so I lived my childhood and youth under my father's watchful eye. I only reached the 8th grade. After that, my father decided I'd learned enough reading and writing for a woman. I spent the rest of my time helping my mother with chores and learning to cook. I think that's why when I met Dan Miller, at 17, I fell in love so quickly. He appeared to me as the possibility of escaping the prison that was my father's house. Dan was 25, a long-haul truck driver who had just moved to our town. He was handsome, quick to smile, and knew how to talk like no one else. We met at a charity event at the local church. I remember I was helping serve refreshments when he approached the counter. He looked straight into my eyes and said, "The food must be as beautiful as the cook." My face turned red as a beet, but I felt something different that day, a flutter in my stomach I'd never felt before. Soon, my father noticed his intentions, but he didn't object when Dan asked for permission to court me. In fact, I think my father was even relieved. A married daughter meant one less mouth to feed. Our courtship was short and always chaperoned. We were never alone. My mother, my sister, or one of my brothers was always nearby. Still, in those few moments we had together, Dan made me dream of a different life. He promised me he would take me one day to see the lights of Los Angeles. "Ellie," he would tell me, "you deserve more than this little life here. With me you will know the world." And I believed him with all the force of my young, inexperienced heart. The wedding was set for August 1973. I had just turned 18. In the months leading up to it, I barely slept from the anxiety. Finally, I would leave my father's house. Finally, I would take the reins of my own life. Finally, I would be able to breathe without that feeling of suffocating. On the night before the wedding, there was a small party at our house. Nothing too extravagant, just dinner with close family and a few neighbors. Dan couldn't come because he'd gone to pick up the rented tuxedo from a cousin in the next county. He would only return the next morning, just in time for the ceremony at the church at 10 a.m. The house was full that night. My aunts were helping with the finishing touches on my simple, but to me most beautiful dress. My mother was cooking non-stop, and the scent of delicious food filled all the rooms. My brothers were coming and going, carrying borrowed chairs, setting up the yard where the food would be served after the ceremony. Amidst all that movement, my father was strangely silent, sitting on his porch swing, smoking his cigarette, and watching everything with a look I couldn't interpret. From time to time, our eyes would meet, and I would feel a strange shiver. There was something different about him, something that made me uneasy without knowing why. When everyone had left and the house was finally silent, I went to the small room I shared with my sister. I was packing my few clothes when the door to the room opened. It was my father. He closed the door behind him and just stood there, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. "Tomorrow you leave," he finally said in an unusual voice. "You will become another man's woman?" "Yes, Papa," I answered softly, surprised by the conversation. My father was never one for many words, much less for showing affection or concern. He came closer, sat on the edge of the bed where I was folding my clothes, and put his hand on my shoulder in a way that made me freeze. "Do you know what happens between a man and a woman on the wedding night?" he asked, his eyes fixed on mine in a way that made me want to look away, but I couldn't. "Yes, I know, Papa," I stammered, feeling my face burn. "No, you don't," he said. His voice was now a harsh whisper, "but I will teach you." What happened in the following minutes is something I've tried to erase from my memory for decades. The heavy hand covering my mouth so I wouldn't scream, the heavy body on top of mine, the physical and psychological pain as I was violated by the man who was supposed to protect me, the silent tears that ran down my face while I begged God for it to end soon. When it finally finished, he got up, adjusted his clothes as if nothing had happened, and before leaving the room he said, "Now you know, and you won't make a fool of yourself tomorrow." I remained paralyzed until I heard my sister arrive. I quickly covered myself, pretended to be asleep. I couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? My father was respected, a good man in the eyes of society, and even if they did believe me, what would happen to my wedding? Would Dan still want a used woman? I spent the night awake, my eyes wide open in the dark, my body hurting, my soul torn apart. In the morning, I got up mechanically, bathed, got dressed. I walked toward the altar like a sleepwalker. I saw Dan waiting for me, handsome in his rented tuxedo, his eyes shining with happiness. I saw my father beside me, leading me, as tradition dictated.
The same man who had destroyed something inside me hours before.
That night, in the little room in our new house, when Dan tried to touch me with all affection and respect, I stiffened. I couldn't explain why. I just cried so hard that he got scared, wondering what was wrong. "I'm just nervous," I lied between sobs. "I need time." Dan, being the good man he was, respected my wish. We slept holding hands that first night and for several nights after. It wasn't until about a month later that I could allow him to touch me, and even then I closed my eyes tightly so as not to see my father's face superimposed on his. Our married life began like this, with that terrible secret between us. Dan traveled a lot. He would sometimes be away for weeks with his truck. I stayed at home trying to build some semblance of a normal life, trying to forget. Slowly, I adapted to the role of a wife. A couple of months after the wedding, I realized my period hadn't come. I was pregnant. The news that should have brought joy brought panic. I started counting. The baby growing inside me was not my husband's, but my father's. In those days, in 1973, there wasn't a kind of genetic testing they do now to confirm paternity. There was no way to prove anything. And even if I could, how would I explain the situation? Who would believe me? How would I tell Dan? The fear was greater than the guilt. If I told the truth, I would lose everything. My marriage, my home, my honor. So I did what so many women before me have done when trapped by fate. I swallowed my tears and went on. I pretended everything was fine, that this pregnancy was only a reason for joy. When I told Dan, he almost exploded with happiness. He carried me around the room, made plans, even started building a wooden crib. "It will be a boy," he would say, convinced, strong like his father and with his mother's gentle heart. Every joyful word from him was a stab in my chest. The feeling of guilt was eating me, but the fear was greater. I couldn't tell him. I gave birth to Claire on a rainy dawn in May 1974. It was a difficult and long delivery. When the local nurse finally placed the baby in my arms, I expected to feel rejection, disgust even, toward that child who carried my tormentor's blood. But what I felt was a love so immense, so overwhelming, that it barely fit in my chest. I looked at that little face and saw only my daughter. Dan arrived 2 days later. He looked at his daughter with a love so great that my heart twisted with guilt. "She is perfect," he whispered, "the spitting image of you, Ellie." I thanked God in that moment that Claire didn't resemble my father at all. She carried my features. It was a small miracle in the midst of the nightmare. When Claire was 6 months old, I received the visit I feared. My father showed up unannounced. "I came to see my granddaughter," he said simply, as if he had every right to be there. "She is not your granddaughter," I answered instinctively, stepping back. "She is nothing to you." In that moment, I saw comprehension flash across his face like lightning. He understood what I was trying to say. He understood that I knew Claire was his daughter, not his granddaughter.
"Watch what you say, girl," he threatened in a low voice. "Some things are better left buried." "Go," I pleaded, my legs feeling weak, but I stood firm. "Go, and never come back. I don't want you near my daughter ever." He stared at me for a long time. Finally, he put his hat back on and headed for the door. Before leaving, he turned around one last time. "You owe your father obedience, Ellie. Always. Don't forget it." In the following days, I lived in constant alert. When Claire turned 1, I received a letter from my mother saying my father was determined to visit us the following month. Panic took hold. I couldn't allow him to come. How could I stop him without arousing suspicion? It was then that I made a radical decision. We needed to move far away, somewhere my father couldn't find us easily. I convinced Dan that moving to Los Angeles, California would be a new adventure, a fresh start. We sold the little we had for a few $1,000s, gathered our savings, and in less than a month, we were on a bus heading to the West Coast.
The first months in Los Angeles were difficult. The city was a brutal contrast to the quiet country life we knew. Dan got a job as an assistant in a mechanic shop in central LA. I started making and selling my signature pecan and apple pies, and slowly I began to sell ready-made deli lunches to the nearby office workers. Slowly, our lives started to stabilize. The ghost of my father began to fade. The distance and time built a barrier, fragile though it was, protecting us from those memories. Claire was growing up bright and healthy, and Dan was the most devoted father a girl could ask for. It was in the market, nearly 2 years after our move in 1976, that the past caught up with me. I was busy preparing a batch of pies when I heard a voice that made me freeze. "I can't believe I found you, daughter." It was my father, Robert Vance, older, more worn out, but with the same look that haunted my nightmares. "What do you want?" I asked, looking around to make sure Claire wasn't nearby. "I want to see my granddaughter, or rather, my daughter." The blood froze in my veins. This was the first time he had openly admitted it. "Go," I whispered fiercely. "You have nothing of yours here." "Yes, I do," he insisted, his voice low but menacing. "And if you don't let me see her nicely, I'll tell your husband everything. How do you think he'll react when he finds out he's raising my daughter as his own?" That was the threat I feared the most. That night, Dan came home early. He was pale, his hands shaking. "A man came looking for me at the shop today. He said he was your father." My world collapsed. "He told me that Claire is not my daughter, that you were pregnant by another man when we got married, and that you lied to me all this time." He banged the table. "Is it true, Ellie? Tell me it's not true." I couldn't lie any more. "It's true," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "Claire is not your biological daughter, but you are the only father she knows."
"Who is the father?" he asked after a long silence, his voice low and choked. "It doesn't matter who he is," I pleaded. "It was just once, a terrible mistake that never happened again." "Does it not matter? I spent 3 years believing I had a daughter, and now I discover I was raising another man's child." The argument was interrupted by Claire's cry. When I returned, Dan was gone. He had left without saying where he was going. He returned the next morning, calmer, but visibly exhausted. "Was it forced? Did someone force you, Ellie?"
The question hung in the air, heavy as lead. For the first time, someone had put words to what had happened. Before I could control it, the words came out between sobs. "Yes," I confessed. "Yes, it was forced. On our wedding night. It was my father." Dan sat down, stunned. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He looked at Claire, sleeping peacefully, and then at me. I saw a mix of horror for my father's act and profound pity for me. The next day, he made a decision. We are moving again to Portland, Oregon. It's far enough and big enough for us to get lost in the crowd. He also told me he had confronted my father, threatening to go to the police and expose his respected reputation if he ever bothered us again. "He won't bother you again," Dan promised, though he admitted he didn't trust him either. In Portland, we started over again. Dan opened his own mechanic shop. I adapted my baking to local tastes, and my small pie stall grew into a small, well-known restaurant, Ellie's Corner Bake Shop. Claire grew up beautiful and intelligent, blissfully unaware of the dark secret that shadowed her birth. In 1979, I became pregnant again. This time, the child was truly Dan's, a genuine symbol of our reconstructed love. Our son, Jamie, was born in December 1979. Life achieved a balance I never thought possible. Years passed. Claire, now 25, became a brilliant nurse, engaged to a doctor named Ethan. Jamie was a skilled mechanic working with his father. We thought the dark chapter of our lives was over. Then, one evening in September 1999, Claire told us she was pregnant. The problem is, the child is not Ethan's. A chilling silence fell. "The father of my child is my biological father," she said, the words a strained whisper. The room spun. My biological father was dead. My mother had written to me years ago saying he'd passed away, a lie she'd later admitted to, hoping it would bring me peace. "How did you find him?" I asked, trembling. "I found some old letters, enough to piece together the truth about my biological father," Claire confessed. "I looked for him, and I found him. He's alive. He lives in San Diego, California." The sheer horror was overwhelming. Robert Vance was not dead.
"What did he do to you?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. Claire lowered her eyes. "He presented himself as a distant relative. He was kind, gained my trust, and then it happened. Only then did he reveal the truth that he was the biological father who was with you before your marriage." The cycle of horror had repeated itself. My daughter was pregnant with the son of my tormentor. Dan stood up, his face etched with fury. "Where is he now?" "At a hotel downtown. He followed me to Portland. He says he wants to be part of the child's life." I knew what had to be done. We could not allow this evil to continue. We had to break the cycle. I finally told Claire the entire terrible truth of my own past. Dan immediately called his lawyer, Reynolds. "We'll get a restraining order against him, and then we go to the police. We're not running anymore." The part of me that had carried this weight for 3 decades was now screaming that this nightmare had to end. As planned, Claire waited in a modest hotel lobby in downtown Portland. She was strong and professional, but her hands were tightly clasped. When Robert Vance approached, with his tired face and unchanged, cunning gaze, he offered a false smile. "I know everything, Robert," Claire said in a quiet, chilling voice. "I know who you are, what you did to my mother, and what you tried to do to me." At that moment, Dan appeared, his face set with determination, accompanied by the lawyer Reynolds and 2 plainclothes police officers. "Robert Vance," Dan called out loudly, "this is my daughter, Claire Miller, and my wife, Ellie. You will never approach them again." Robert's face twisted from surprise to violent rage. He started shouting, but the 2 officers moved quickly, calmly containing him. Reynolds presented the documents. "We have an active restraining order and notice of a formal investigation into the allegations of assault and manipulation concerning my client's daughter." Robert tried to resist, but when he realized he was no longer facing the frightened young Ellie, but a tight-knit family backed by the law, his strength failed him. He was led away, ending decades of ugly pursuit and threats. That evening, Claire returned home. She was exhausted, but felt a peace she had never known. I'm free, Mama," Claire sighed. "The monster no longer has any power." After days of deep reflection, Claire made her final decision about the baby. She told Ethan, her fiancé, the whole truth. It was the hardest conversation of her life. Ethan, the loyal young doctor, took time to process the horror. Ultimately, Ethan could not reconcile his pain with the shocking circumstances of the pregnancy. With love, but also with sorrow, Ethan broke off the engagement. As for the pregnancy, Claire decided to carry on. "This child doesn't represent what he did to me," she told her parents. "He represents the strength of our family to survive and move forward. I will raise this child with the same love you raised me with, Papa Dan, so he grows up without bearing the burden of this ugly origin." Dan adopted the newborn child. David, named for Ellie's late grandfather, as a symbolic claim to the good in the family's past, was born in late 2000, the final piece of healing for the family.
Reynolds pursued the case against Robert Vance, though a full conviction for the old violations was difficult due to the passage of time. The investigations revealed a pattern of abusive behavior toward women. Ellie's and Claire's testimonies led to Robert's conviction on lesser charges related to threats and violating the restraining order, which put him behind bars long enough to ensure the family's safety and break his influence forever. By 2015, Ellie was in her 60s. The restaurant Ellie's Corner Bake Shop was thriving. Claire was a registered nurse and a strong single mother, devoted to her son David, a happy, loved child. Jamie and young David worked side by side with Dan in the prosperous mechanic shop. Ellie sat on the patio of a restaurant, watching her grandchildren play. She looked at Dan, laughing with Claire. Their lives hadn't been easy. They were built on a foundation of trauma and painful lies. But beneath it all was a solid stone of love, devotion, and the courage to break the old cycle of violence. Ellie never regretted the lie she lived to protect her daughter, because that lie allowed them to build a much more beautiful truth. She sipped her hot tea and finally felt the profound peace she had fought for 3 decades. The old pie seller had finally won. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more real-life experiences about building a life from scratch. Thank you for listening, and remember, never let fear dictate your silence. Silence doesn't protect. It only allows the darkness to linger, to breed, and eventually to return for those you love most. Seek the light, find your truth, and shatter the cycle. Drop a like. Share this story with someone who might need to hear that message today.